There's a specific kind of quiet in a shop right before you start a knife. It's the calm before the storm of grit and sparks. But lately, I've had folks coming in asking if they should start with a hammer or a grinder. And it's like asking if you should learn to swim in a pool or the middle of the Atlantic.
Always with the metaphors, Tiger. But seriously, for someone who hasn't even touched a piece of steel, the Atlantic, aka forging, looks a lot more intimidating than the pool of stock removal. Is there actually a right way to break into this?
Nature of the beast is that everyone wants to be a Viking on day one. They see the glowing orange steel and the sparks flying and they want to start swinging. But truthfully, my first knife was basically a glorified file that I ground down until it looked vaguely like something you'd use to butter toast. It wasn't pretty, and I definitely didn't need a forge to ruin it.
So we're talking stock removal versus forging today, the shave it away method versus the beat it into submission method. If I'm a total greenhorn, why wouldn't I just buy a pre-made blade and put a handle on it? Is that cheating?
Not even a little bit. In fact, that's like buying the cake layers and just doing the frosting. If you can't get the handle to fit right or the guard to sit flush, it doesn't matter if you forge the blade from a meteorite. It's still going to feel like a hunk of junk in the hand. Starting with a pre-hardened blank lets you focus on the jewelry side of knife making, the fit, the finish, the ergonomics. If you can't make a comfortable handle, you haven't made a knife. You've made a sharpened hazard.
Okay, let's say I've passed Handle 101 and I want to actually shape the metal. Stock removal seems straightforward. Take a bar of steel, draw a knife, and grind away everything that isn't a knife. What's the catch?
The catch is patience and heat. You're basically an artist with an eraser, but the eraser is a belt sander moving at 30 miles an hour. One of the biggest blunders I see, and believe me, I've got a bucket of purple overheated steel to prove it, is rushing the grind. If you're working with annealed steel, you have some wiggle room. But once that blade is hardened, if you see the tip turn blue while you're grinding, the soul of that steel just left the building. You've lost the temper.
The soul left the building. You mean you turned it into a very expensive, very brittle letter opener?
Exactly. You're standing there leaning into the grinder thinking you're making great time, and suddenly the edge is the color of a peacock feather. At that point, you might as well use it to stir paint.
So, for stock removal, what are we looking at for a starter kit? Because I looked at those professional grinders, and they cost more than my first car.
Yeah, don't go buying a 3 horsepower variable speed monster just to see if you like the hobby. Honestly, a decent 1x30 sander from a hardware store and a handful of good ceramic belts will get you through your first 5 knives. But the real secret? Files. A good set of Nicholson files and a Goff jig, which is just a fancy way of saying a bolt and a piece of wood to keep your angle steady, will teach you more about bevels than a power tool ever will. It's slow, it's sweaty, and your elbows will hate you, but you'll actually understand the geometry of the edge.
Speaking of geometry, let's talk about the scary stuff, forging. Jim Saviano, a master smith, mentions moving the steel under the hammer by locking your hand to your hip. That sounds oddly like dancing.
It's exactly like dancing, just with more chances of a third-degree burn. When you're at the anvil, you don't want to be flailing your arms. You want the hammer to stay in a consistent arc, and you move the hot steel underneath it. It's a rhythm. If you're chasing the steel all over the face of the anvil, you're going to end up with a blade that looks like a topographical map of the Ozarks.
Saviano also mentions normalizing and annealing. I feel like these are the terms people nod along to while secretly having no clue what they mean. Break it down for the rest of us.
Don't tell the metallurgist I'm oversimplifying this. Think of the molecules in the steel like a bunch of rowdy kids in a classroom. When you're hammering on that metal, you're stressing them out, pushing them into corners. Normalizing is like ringing the bell for recess. You heat the steel up just past magnetic and let it air cool. It lets the internal structure relax and reset. Annealing is the slow cooker version. You heat it up and bury it in something like vermiculite so it stays warm for hours. That makes the steel soft enough to files or drill without breaking your tools.
So if I skip that, I'm basically trying to drill through a diamond with a toothpick?
Pretty much. I once spent $40 on guaranteed cobalt drill bits trying to get through a tang I hadn't annealed properly. I ended up with 3 melted bits in a hole that wasn't even deep enough to hold a pin. I was stubborn, thought I could power through it. Turns out, the steel is always more stubborn than you are.
Let's talk about the U-shape Saviano warns about. He says if you don't grind the corners off the tip before you start forging the point down, the steel curves into a U. I'm guessing you've made a few steel horseshoes by accident?
Oh, more than a few. When you hit the top edge of a flat bar to make a point, the metal has to go somewhere. It wants to curve away from the blow. If you aren't careful, you end up with fish lips, this weird overlap of metal at the tip that traps scale and slag inside. It's a structural nightmare. Now, I usually just take the bar to the grinder for 30 seconds, nip those corners off, and save myself 20 minutes of frustration at the anvil. It's not cheating to use a power tool to help your forge work. It's just being a good neighbor to your future self.
You mentioned steel types earlier. 1084 seems to be the golden child for beginners. Why that specifically? Why not just use an old leaf spring from the junkyard? It's free.
Ah, the mystery metal trap. Look, I love a good recycled project as much as the next guy, but for a beginner, it's a recipe for heartbreak. A leaf spring has lived a hard life. It might have microscopic stress cracks you can't see until the very last stage of heat treating when you hear that terrifying ping in the oil quench. 1084 is what I call polite steel. It hardens easily, it's forgiving on the temperature, and you know exactly how it's going to behave. Using unknown steel is like trying to bake a cake with a mystery powder you found in the back of the pantry. It might be flour, or it might be plaster of Paris.
Polite steel. I like that. So let's say I've forged my blade, I've normalized it, and I've ground it to a clean finish. Now we get to the moment of truth, the heat treat. This is where the magic and the crying happens, right?
This is the soul check of the knife. You're taking it to a specific temperature, usually when a magnet stops sticking to it, and then dunking it in oil. The quench, as we call it, it's a violent transition for the metal. It goes from 1500 degrees to 150 inches a few seconds. If there's a flaw in your grind, or if you didn't normalize it, that's when the blade will warp or, heaven forbid, crack.
And the oil matters, right? You're not just using leftover French fry grease?
Well, some old-timers swear by the smell of canola oil, but a dedicated quenching oil is much more consistent. The real mistake folks make is the swish. They dunk the knife and move it side to side like they're stirring a soup. Standard rule of thumb, move it slicing style, back and forth, or just hold it dead still. Moving it sideways creates uneven cooling on the faces, and bam, you've got a blade shaped like a banana.
A banana knife, very specialized, great for peeling curved things.
Very funny. I actually had a Bowie knife once, about 10 inches of blade, that I'd spent 40 hours on. Forged it, ground it, hand sanded it to 600 grit. I got impatient during the quench, moved it a little too fast sideways, and it came out with a half-inch warp. I tried to help it straight while it was still hot, and snap. The sound of a blade breaking in the shop is the loneliest sound in the world. It's the sound of 40 hours of your life turning into two 20-hour paperweights.
That hurts just hearing it, but that's why we temper it immediately after, right?
Exactly. Once it comes out of the oil, it's glass hard. You could drop it on the floor and it might literally shatter. You put it in a kitchen oven, assuming your spouse is okay with the smell of burnt oil, at about 400 degrees for a couple of hours. That draws back some of that hardness and gives the blade toughness. It's the difference between a glass rod and a spring. You want a knife that can cut, but you also want a knife that won't snap if you accidentally drop it on a rock.
We've talked a lot about the blade, but Jim Saviano also touches on the hidden tang handle and the guard. To me, a guard seems like the hardest part to get right. It's a tiny piece of metal that has to fit a flat blade perfectly.
It's the trial by fire for your filing skills. Fitting a guard is like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces change shape if you push too hard. You file a little, you try to fit it, you see where the high spots are, and you repeat. If you get it wrong and the gap is too wide, there's no undo button. You either live with a sloppy joint, which is a sin in my book, or you start over with a fresh piece of brass or steel.
And then comes the sharpening, which is surprisingly something people forget to learn until the very end.
It's true. I've seen guys make beautiful art pieces that couldn't cut a warm stick of butter. Sharpening is its own discipline. But if you've done your geometry right, if you've ground those bevels thin enough before you even start with the whetstones, the edge will practically jump out at you. If you leave the edge as thick as a nickel, you're going to be at those stones until next Tuesday, trying to get a hair shaving edge.
So, if I'm listening to this and I'm ready to set my garage on fire, figuratively, hopefully, what's the one piece of advice you'd give for that first real project?
Don't try to make the ultimate survival sword. Use a piece of 1084, keep it under 4 inches of blade, and don't worry about making it perfect. My first few knives weren't masterpieces. They were tuition. They were the price I paid to learn how steel moves and how a grinder bites. And honestly, take pictures of the ugly ones. Because a year from now, when you finish a knife that actually looks like a knife, you're going to want to look back at that first butter knife and realize just how far those calluses have brought you.
I think that's the takeaway right there. Respect the process, embrace the ugly phase, and maybe keep a fire extinguisher near the forge.
Definitely the fire extinguisher, and maybe some band-aids. You aren't a real knife maker until you've accidentally tried to pick up a piece of steel that looked cold, but was actually 400 degrees.
Duly noted. I'll keep my hands to myself. Thanks for walking us through the fire, Tiger.
Anytime, Alex. Now, let's go see if I can't straighten out that banana blade I've been hiding in the scrap bin.